You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
Ended up traveling to more than 40 countries in the continent. That really changed my life. Making money or doing business is the way to connect people. I wanted to join this interesting, dynamic market. We started investing in early stage startups and we deployed 18 million US dollars into more than 100 startups. And when we started investing, the biggest funding gap existed in early stage deals. One thing I'm not so happy with, most investors into Africa are not based in Africa.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have a very special guest, Satoshi Shinada, who is a partner at Kepple Africa Ventures. Welcome to the podcast, Satoshi. How are you and how's Lagos today?
Thank you, Tarza, for inviting me to your prestigious podcast. And yeah, I'm doing well in Lagos. It is like my second hometown now.
Fantastic. So I was hoping before we kind of get into the conversation, you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about who Satoshi Shinada is.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm Satoshi. I have spent almost 8 years now in Nigeria. My first exposure to Africa was when I was the first year student at undergrad in Tokyo. I decided to take a gap year and I came to the continent to travel around. I was a backpacker hippie guy and I ended up traveling to more than 40 countries in the continent. And I think that really changed my life. One of the big learning from that journey was that making money or doing a business is the way to connect people because you find different people from different ethnic groups, from different countries traveling around. You can even find like Igbo trader in Sudan or Mali, why they are connected with the local communities is because they are doing trading. And I wanted to join this interesting, dynamic market by becoming a part of this business relationship. And I thought this would make everyone equal on the same ground. And I just decided to join a Japanese company doing investment and trading in Africa. And then I was assigned to Nigeria from 2010 to 2015, spending 4.5 years in Nigeria. And I led investment into an infrastructure project, which went well. I was starting to ask myself if this is something I want to continue for the rest of my life. And I thought it's a bit boring because infrastructure business is more like transplanting existing recipe into Africa and applying it. Also, I tend to work with old big people in this industry, but I thought it would be more interesting to work with passion-driven, vision-driven people. And 2014, 2015 was the great timing because that was when I started to see more entrepreneurs in Africa. And that was also quite against my bias or perception about brain drain.
Okay.
Now these brilliant talents returning to Nigeria and trying to combine new technologies with the market potential here. So I felt that now the people sitting on the driver's seat is gradually changing from old big people to young, passionate entrepreneurs. And I really wanted to work with these people. And they also belong to the same generation as me. So I decided to change my career. And that's when my new journey as an VC investor was going to start. And after a while, I was back to Japan. Then I went to the US for my MBA. And while I was at school, I had a chance to work with a VC fund based in Nigeria. So that exposed me to the ecosystem here. And after that, we started Kepple Africa Ventures together with my two other partners. And I relocated back to Nigeria in 2019. And we started investing in early stage startups. And we deployed 18 million US dollars, 1/8, into more than 100 startups across 11 markets in Africa. And now we are in the second journey of our VC investment. And now we are running a VC fund called Berod Kepple Africa Ventures, which is a joint venture between Berod Capital, based in Nigeria, and Kepple Africa Ventures that has been run by three of us.
Fantastic. Thank you for that intro. So obviously you've mentioned you being originally from Japan, traveling across over 40 African countries and how you managed to land in Lagos, and you've made Lagos your home now for the last 8 years. Amazing, amazing, amazing. You're officially a Lagosian.
Yeah, thank you.
In terms of the early stages or starting of Berod Kepple Africa Ventures, tell us about how the company started and how did you identify there was a need for what you were planning to offer?
Yeah, so we started as a very early stage focused VC as Kepple Africa Ventures. And in the past 3 years since we invested as Kepple Africa Ventures, we noticed a change in the ecosystem. And when we started investing, the biggest funding gap existed in early stage deals. And they needed more capital, quick capital into these great entrepreneurs. And we wanted to fill that gap. So that's why we were originally focused on early stage deals. And we also wanted to solve another gap, which is like a mismatch between what startups here need and available type of investors. And if you compare Africa and Asia, in Africa, you lack strategic investors. You mainly find financial investors and impact-driven investors. And we also wanted to fill that gap. So we becoming an anchor investor and providing seed capital into great startups. And we connect them with later stage investors, strategic investors from Japan. And for example, last year alone, we brought 7 Japanese companies listed on Tokyo Stock Exchange to make their first direct investment into African startups in our portfolio. So that are the kind of the values that we have been bringing to the ecosystem. But as I said, now the market is changing. We are seeing more new funds coming into early stage, and it's getting congested. In the later stage, we are seeing more global big investors coming into Africa, such as SoftBank or Tiger Global, Sequoia are coming. So we noticed that Series A and Series B startups are becoming a bottleneck. They need more larger capital to facilitate the growth of that phase. And we wanted to react to that market demand. So we decided to move up to Series A and Series B. But also we noticed that we are not good enough to serve the growth phase startups because although we are based in Africa, we are the Japanese capitalists. So we cannot really provide a very deep local hands-on support to our portfolio companies. And that's why we thought we need a very reliable partner. And I reached out to Berod when I was still a student at Harvard doing MBA. And the partner of Berod, Dan Laddy, is also alum of HBS.
Oh, so interesting.
So I was reaching out to him. And when I reached out to him, actually, he didn't even believe me because he thought I'm Japanese, I'm not going to commit to Nigeria for a long time. And we just had a very casual chat. But like after a year, we met again, coincidentally, at Wheat Baker Hotel when I was having a meeting with another startup, and I think he was also back from another meeting. And he found me and he said, "Oh, Satoshi, what you're doing here?" And I told him that we studied the ventures, and now I am fully a resident in Lagos. And then how that conversation evolved into potential partnership because they were also looking to expand their asset class to VC, and we were also looking for the very strong, reliable local partner. So it clicked and we decided to work together. And actually, this marriage is quite interesting. And I think it makes us so unique and outstanding in the ecosystem because now we have all the experience and expertise of Berod of supporting SMEs as a PE investor, and we can institutionalize it into the VC context. So we rely on their massive experience of providing operational support, strategic support. They have great finance team, accounting team, and also impact and ESG specialists. And they're also good at facilitating the relationship with regulators. So these are all what Kepple alone could not provide to our portfolio companies. Well, we can still bring more and more Japanese strategic investors as potential partner for the startups and even acquirer of the startups so that we can provide more liquidity to the ecosystem. So this is how we are differentiated from other VCs.
Sounds like an amazing partnership. Very exciting for the African tech ecosystem. You mentioned that Keppel Africa Ventures was created as you identified that the biggest funding gap in Africa is early stage deals, and also there's a mismatch of investment. So if you look at your investment in terms of what you've achieved so far, you've invested in some exceptional startups such as Move. I was wondering if we can delve deeper in terms of what is your process or thesis for discovering startups that have investment potential?
Yeah, so we decided not to have sector-based investment thesis. Rather, we would have more broader investment thesis that fit to the realities of the market in Africa. And actually, we are already seeing lots of crossover between sectors, and especially fintech is being embedded into different business models. So we would rather decided to have the three broad categories that we want to invest in. And the first investment pillar is that we want to invest in a kind of infrastructure platform business model on which other businesses can build on. And the second pillar is efficiency and productivity solver for B2B. And in Africa, the consumer spending power is still low compared to other markets. And also the price of supply is high because African economy is dependent on lots of import. And also because there are a lot of inefficiencies in the supply chain. So first of all, before growing B2C businesses, we have to make the price of supply more affordable for the consumers. And to do so, I think it is very important to work on B2B supply chain side, first of all. So that's our priority. And also because the unemployment rate is quite high in Africa, which means that most consumers are actually individual business owners. So they have to be empowered as business first. And also in that context, focusing on B2B first makes sense because once their business starts to grow, they have more spending power as consumers. So I noticed that we are already in the transition from B2B to B2C in Africa. We still keep helping B2B businesses to grow. So that's the second pillar. And the third pillar tries to cater to more dynamic new emergence of work style and lifestyle due to penetration of mobile phone and internet. So we try to focus more on creating a new market, new services to cater to the taste and the needs of Africans. So it includes African contents. So these are the three pillars that we focus on.
So yeah, you've kind of beautifully detailed the three broad categories or pillars that you look at when considering the investment potential of a company. So when you look at the type or size of the company that you want to invest in, what market cap or market value of company do you tend to steer towards?
Yeah, so we have been shifting our focus from seed stage to Series A. So of course, there's a change. But of course, we have a kind of benchmark in our mind. For example, like if you want to invest in early stage deals, we don't want the valuation to exceed, for example, $10 million US. We have such kind of broad benchmark in our mind, but it also depends like how the startups is performing against such benchmark. So we don't have like very strict criteria for the valuation, but we also try to see if the growth of the startup is based on like strong fundamentals or just based on hype. And some startups can grow very quickly based on the hype. And based on the hype, they grow, they fundraise a lot, and then they spend on marketing and grow.
Yes.
But sometimes we could become very skeptical about that cycle. So we basically look more into the fundamentals. And when I say fundamentals, I'm not asking for a lot, especially for early stage startups. But we need to at least see that there is a strong product market fit or potential strong product market fit. And we try to judge that potential based on the founder and also their track record of monetizing from the business. And I think Africa is quite a difficult place to monetize because people are not really willing to pay. And in order to let people pay, we have to be focused on deep burning pain of these users. So we call it like pain game. The service should be tackling the deepest pain of the customers so that without that solution, the customer cannot survive anymore and they are forced to pay. So we need a startup to have a clear understanding of well-defined customers' pain points. That's very important. And also market size is, of course, important. So we look at all these aspects, especially the strength of monetization, which would be the background of the fundamental of their business. And we try to avoid the companies with hype. And of course, there are some other things that would be positive in our assessment, such as like having revenue in maybe hard currencies or having very good cash flow cycle or focusing more on infrastructure platform layer instead of marketing layer. So these are all the things that we really look into.
So you touched on your market value criteria is quite fluid, which is great because it means that you don't eliminate some potential startups early on before delving deep into the fundamentals of the business. Earlier on, you also mentioned that within the early stage investment space in Africa, it's getting quite congested, which kind of means those promising startups probably have more choice than they would have previously had when it comes to selecting whose investment to accept. Which means that, I guess, investors essentially have to add value when they invest in a startup. So I was wondering, as an early stage investor, what do you actually do for a company in terms of how do you add value? What is a day or a week in the life of an early stage investor in Africa?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I don't think we need to provide a lot of overlapping services to the startups when we talk about the competition among the investors. Rather, we would focus on providing very unique value to the startups so that other investors would also appreciate because they cannot bring that value. So I think providing a unique value in the very competitive space would be important. And that's why we focus more on bringing strategic investors from Japan, which cannot be imitated by other VCs. If we bring these strategic investors, that will be appreciated by everyone because the startup can now move on to the next round. And other VCs are also happy because their portfolio companies are now moving up to the next round with higher valuation. And also these Japanese strategic investors could potentially acquire the startup. And which relieves the biggest headache of other investors. So I think that was very key strategy for us to survive in the competition with other investors. And I think being Japanese also helped us a bit because we
Okay.
are not involved in like different groups of the local investors. We are neutral to everyone, and we are friendly and nice to everyone. So in case there's a very like maybe competition among investor group A and the investor group B, we can always be a good friend to both parties. So, and we are welcomed by both of them. So I think that also helped us. I think what makes us unique was that we have so many portfolio companies across the continent. And some local VCs have strong presence in one market, but not too much in other market. And maybe they just have like a venture partner there, but not really having operation there. And the good thing with us is that I'm based in Nigeria while my partner is based in Nairobi. So we both have strong foothold in each market. So whenever like Nigerian startup want to expand to Kenya, we can help that startup to establish their local entity and start operation there. And we can connect them to other stakeholders in Kenyan market, for example, and vice versa. So it's a bit strange, but we as a Japanese VC, we could really help like cross-border expansion for our portfolio companies. And also when you have a large pool of portfolio companies, it means that the portfolio companies can help each other because there's enough pool of knowledge and experience. And for example, if one startup is now struggling with, regulator, maybe that issue is already experienced and overcome by other portfolio company. So that company can advise to the other company. So we could create a kind of community of the startups where they can help each other, and which also helped us to save our own resources because our team was not so big with Kepple Africa Ventures back then.
Fantastic. That's great. So you're almost creating your own ecosystem of portfolio companies where people are sharing knowledge, experience, and skills and giving that peer-to-peer support.
Exactly.
What I found interesting there was that you touched upon how you provide unique value by bringing strategic investors from Japan into Africa. And, Japan has a very neutral position within the African investment space, which is great. Currently, we are seeing global economic challenges and volatile stock markets. And as a result, people are saying, or I guess the indication is that funding is slowing down gradually.
Right.
Have you seen the ripple effects of this affecting the African startup ecosystem? And should African startups be concerned?
Yeah, sure. So I think like on statistics, we are still seeing the growth of funding in Africa till May. There was like new statistics coming out, and only Africa is still growing the funding compared to other markets. But I think on the ground, I'm seeing more and more cooling sentiment of investors, and especially in the later stage. I see some of the startups which were planning to do Series A, but now they just decide to do a small bridge round, or they are prepared to take longer time to complete their fundraising. And in some cases, lead investors are pulling out from the deals. So I'm seeing more that negative reaction in the later stage deals. While I still feel maybe early stage deals, investors are not too much negative. And maybe because when the interest rate is going higher, theoretically early stage deals should be more significantly discounted. But maybe it's a bit conflicting, but I think in the investor's mind, they think that we still have time to see how, for the early stage deals, we can still wait and see. So maybe we are not in rush to think about exit when we are investing in early stage deals. So maybe in the next few years, the market will recover and it will normalize. So for the early stage deals, maybe investors can relax more, and that's why there are still a lot of activities in the early stage deals. While in the later stage deals, the check size is of course bigger, and also we are seeing lots of significant discount in the overvalued startups, unicorns in the US. And that is really affecting our perception for the mature startups in Africa too, because also some startups have been very much overvalued, and we are becoming more careful about the valuation. And also, if we invest now into these startups at high valuation, we don't know if they can move to the next round when the market is cooling. So I think investors are in general becoming a bit more cautious in the later stage deal in Africa. And I think that sentiment would ultimately come to affect early stage deals too in a few months.
Okay, interesting. So you mentioned there that globally, with regards to, I guess, startup investments, only Africa is still seeing quite consistent growth and early stage investments isn't being impacted. And in some instances, startups are being overvalued. So from your perspective, is this an inevitable kind of correction of the market? And what does the road to recovery look like?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, some of the startups have been overvalued in Africa, and they grew too quickly by burning cash that they raised from the investors. And I think it still comes back to my point on fundamentals versus hype. And I think we have seen some hype-driven startups becoming almost like a unicorn status so quickly.
Yes.
While we have some companies having very strong fundamentals, but their business model is not very straightforward for foreign investors, because some of these business models are very unique to Africa. So some of the startups that have been growing on hype has very clear comps with the same business model making success in other markets. And I think it's easier to attract more attention and support from the foreign investors in these business models. But there are other models that have very strong fundamentals in the African context with very unique solution in Africa, but which is not very straightforward for the foreign investors. And these companies with strong fundamentals are not even valued less than these companies having been growing on hype. So there's some ironic situation, I think. And of course, adjustment and normalization would take place on these hype-based startups, while we are still bullish to invest in these undervalued startups with strong fundamentals, having more unique business models rooted in Africa.
Brilliant. So you mentioned in terms of fundamental versus hype startups, and obviously certain startups have unique business models that are unique to Africa and not quite straightforward for foreign investors to understand. And essentially, we are seeing a new VC landscape in Africa. So how can early stage startups in Africa adapt to this new VC landscape that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it still comes back to understanding of their customers, the pain points, and building more solid product with moat instead of just pursuing quick growth. So I think very solid startups instead of very fluffy ones should survive. So I think it's a good correction in the market to encourage startups to focus more on solid things. And on the other hand, I think in Africa, we might have been too optimistic that startups can solve everything.
Yes.
But the reality is that clearly Africa has less industrial base compared to Latin America or Asia in terms of like manufacturing or even productivity of agriculture. And startups cannot make all the miracles without strong industrial base. Off-grid power solution cannot solve the lack of power plants. Power plants can produce a lot of power to support manufacturing companies or industrial plants. I don't think off-grid solar can really support enough number of these industries. So maybe when the hype is cooling down, there would be less money flowing into BC, but I think there would be reallocation of money coming into Africa, and especially because BC industries in Africa have been funded from a lot of DFIs, and that is quite unique. If you look at BCs in India or Asia or Latin America, you don't find a lot of LPs from DFI. But in Africa, DFI is still important as important LPs for VCs. And I think maybe there could be more reallocation of the funding from the DFIs or from other investors, so that like the money that has been flowing into startups based on that optimistic scenario of startup can solve everything could be maybe adjusted, and some of the money flow into more conventional and traditional space such as agriculture, manufacturing, and so that there would be a more optimized balance between infrastructure that needs to be built by these conventional industries and the innovation that needs to be built by the startups. And I think we are always trying to find out the optimal balance between the industrial base and the innovation by the startups. Reallocation could support that, finding that balance potentially.
I agree 100%. I think tech is needed in terms of solutions. It's an enabler, but for that to be efficient, effective, economical, we need solid infrastructure underlining the fundamentals and the structure, basically. So you've touched upon how we need to encourage startups to focus on solid fundamentals and the need for Africa to develop solid infrastructure industries such as manufacturing and agriculture, and the reallocation of money coming into Africa from DFIs and other investors. So I read recently that Keppel Africa Ventures is planning to diversify the capital coming into early and growth stage ventures in Africa. Can you tell us a bit more about that and why you think it is needed?
Yes. Although we want to see more diversity in the founders, like female and males or sector balance, but I think we also need to have good diversified investors because they are the source of values and they're the source of the support that we can bring to the startups. And in some cases in Africa, I think investors are quite disconnected to each other. It's not very common for the maybe Asian investors to have deep collaboration with European investors, or DFIs to collaborate with strategic investors from Japan. And also now we have these like crypto Web3 focused investors coming into Africa, but they are not really collaborating with conventional Web2 VCs, investors. So all this fragmentation can prevent startups from collaborating or reaching out to more diverse knowledge base to find the best support from different investors. So as a VC fund, which is facing the startups, I think we need to have larger, diverse LP base behind us so that our portfolio companies can access different resources from different investors behind us. So by combining Bero's LP base and Kepple's LP base, I think we are providing a very unique, diverse combination of different LPs, DFIs, and big corporates. For example, Japan and Europe, Africa and Japan. So we have investor base from all these regions, across these sectors. We have family office, big corporates, DFIs. So I think that would really bring different values to our portfolio companies.
Amazing. So you touched upon in terms of diversifying investor and LP base and how investors in Africa are quite disconnected and fragmented in terms of the ecosystem. But I guess it's great that we're having this conversation and identifying the challenges. And we are even having a conversation in terms of the number of investors currently. I can imagine when you first arrived 8 years ago in Nigeria, there were very few investors who were looking at early stage startups. I know it's difficult to ignore what's happening now, but if we ignore what's happened over the last few months, how has the Nigerian or African startup investment ecosystem evolved since the early days that you were involved?
Sure. So I think we have seen so many successful role models from the successful startups that are even becoming unicorn status. Yes. And I think that inspired new talents to join the ecosystem. So I think there is now a great cycle of successful role model inspiring new talents to start new startups. Or there are some people who are spinning out from the successful startups and starting their own startups. So I think this entrepreneurial journey has now evolved to become more like a community and industry. That's one. And I think there were more tension a few years ago between the startups and big companies in Nigeria, or between the startups and regulators. But now, I think thanks to successful startups in the fintech sector, or maybe in the human resource sector, filling the gap of human talent needs and school systems, such as Andela or Decagon, for example, in the human resource sector. I think now we are seeing less tension between the conventional big players and the startups, or in the relationship between regulators and startups. Of course, we still have a lot of surprising news when regulators are trying to control more on startups, but we are also having a good news of Nigeria now working on startups. So in general, I think the market became more favorable for the startups, and now it can grow more organically. And that organic growth has been supported by the more funding coming into this ecosystem. So I think we have seen so good different parts coming together to help the startups. And I think that's very comparable to what happened in India or Southeast Asia. And maybe the last piece that we thought Africa didn't have enough was more collaboration between the big companies and startups. And I think that piece is also coming up in Africa, because we are seeing more big conglomerates launching their investment arm, or sometimes the C-suite or the owners of these big companies are now becoming more active in angel investing into the startups. And we have more system to accommodate them. Some of the VCs are now accepting different membership program to accept different angel investors to cherry pick what they want to invest in from the deal pipeline that the investor will bring. So I think there are more systems to let these people from the old industry to participate in supporting and investing into the new startup. So I think we are seeing that kind of collaboration.
Brilliant. So you've detailed how the market is more favorable now for startups than it was, say, 8 years ago. And we're seeing a collaboration between startups and large international companies.
Yep.
So leading on from that, previously, there was always a focus on African startups creating local solutions. Yeah, and I think I saw a quote from one of your colleagues that said, "Is anything local anymore?" What's your opinion on that?
I think we still need more local solution actually. And when I compare new business models coming out from, for example, Latin America, sometimes I find their business model more innovative in the way they try to tackle the issues rooted in the local market situation. And the history of African startup ecosystem is not very long.
No.
And sometimes some startups just decided to follow the successful business model from outside, and they didn't really take enough time to come up with really unique local solution. And I think the only local founders can come up with such solution. And I think we need to really nurture a culture to encourage the startups to not just copy the solution that they see in other markets, but also to really, you know, work on the new business model from scratch on the ground. And when I say the startups have very strong fundamentals, usually these companies have made innovation by themselves. I'm not talking about like very complicated tech solution, but it's more about understanding the local market. Maybe it's better to mention some example. For example, like agent banking is, I think, very great solution in Africa where we have unbanked population and maintaining ATMs and bank branches are expensive. And this human ATM agent banking is a really good idea.
Yes, yes.
And yes, and also they can solve the issue of maybe trust or information gap by assigning agents from the local community. And also maybe if we look at a business model like Piggy Vest, I think it's also very unique. It's really focused on saving. And when Naira is depreciating, providing like near inflation yield to the people is really like attractive solution. And we don't have like alternative. And most startups tend to, flock to shiny business model like BNPL, consumer lending. All of these got a lot of attention. And yeah, BNPL is a more recent business model. But I think like in order to in order to build financial literacy, saving is the starting point. But people did not have incentive to save money when depreciation is so high and yield from the bank is so low. So in order to solve that problem, everybody knows that saving is very important, but no one was incentivized to save because of this market situation. And for example, PiggyVest innovated to solve that. And we don't see such like sticky and unique saving platform outside Nigeria. So I think like these two are great examples.
Brilliant. I agree. So you mentioned there in terms of we definitely still need local solutions, innovative solutions that are unique, and there is a need for local founders to lead this. So in terms of discussing innovative solutions and startup ideas, what trends in Africa's investment space are you currently excited about?
Yeah, maybe in addition to the examples that I mentioned, such as TeamUp or PiggyVest, I think it's also, for me, how SMEs or gig economy is empowered through the startups is quite interesting because unfortunately, unemployment rate is so high in Africa. So most of the people have to work as individual business owners. And it was very difficult for them to scale their business or grow their revenue or make their business more efficient. But now there are so many tools and systems provided by startups, these SMEs or gig workers. And as a foreigner living in Nigeria, I could never imagine hopping onto someone's random car like 7 years ago. But now I can use Bolt or Uber, and gig economy has become like part of infrastructure in Africa. And maybe, I'm also very encouraged by how Web3 and blockchain would change the landscape of this gig economy, because maybe Uber or Bolt are still like centralized platform, and lots of margin is taken by these platformers. But once we have, Web3 based infrastructure, the users and gig workers are more aligned and incentivized. And so, I'm really excited how this gig economy and SMEs would evolve through the support from the startups, and of course, financial inclusion and providing payment infrastructure to these stakeholders is also very important. And once we have more, once we see the growth of these SMEs and gig workers, I think we would see more active B2C business models in Africa. So I think this is also partly helping the market to make a transition from B2B dominant ecosystem to potential more live B2C ecosystem in Africa.
You mentioned something that I'm excited about, which is the gig economy, the need to develop employment within Africa. And you also touched upon Web3, blockchain, and other current and future trends. So if we stick to the theme of, I guess, the future trends or the future of Africa, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time from a VC perspective?
Our fund is still running in 5 years, so I have to be optimistic, and I want to see more unicorns coming out from Africa. And also, I think lots of, not only the innovation of business model itself could potentially come out from Africa, but I also think like when the new business models are emerging out of Africa, there are more to learn for the VCs in Africa. And one thing I'm not so happy with is that most investors into Africa are not based in Africa. While there should be a lot to learn from Africa. So my hope is that in 5 years, maybe we are seeing more venture capitalists actually coming to Africa and learning from the VCs here, because this is where the new way of assessing new business models and investing in the startups are evolving as a VC business. That's something that I want to see in the next 5 years. And obviously, there are not only the lack of CTOs and tech talents or even sales staff for the startups, but there's a serious lack of actually the capitalists too, because it seems like the salary of associates or analysts or anyone who is working for VC has been going up. And of course, that might be also cooling down because of the current economic situation. But when there is a lack of capitalists, we need more like homegrown capitalists coming out of Africa, and there should be more foreign capitalists who would come to Africa and learn in the ecosystem. So that's something I want to see in 5 years.
Brilliant. You've given us a very pragmatic, practical, and realistic view in terms of what you want to see or where you see Africa in 5 years' time from a VC perspective. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and Verold Kepple Africa in 5 years' time?
Yeah, of course, we want to stay as a top performer in this space. and hope we can be an important catalyst for the startups to keep growing. And also we want to remain a very important bridge to connect African startups, African investors with foreign investors, and also foreign partners to work with the startups in Africa. So we want to make sure that we will be playing that role with more impact in this space.
Amazing, and I believe you'll achieve that. As we discussed earlier, in terms of what you provide, it's very unique strategic value that you provide to the ecosystem and to the startup. So I'm very excited to see which other gems and exciting startups you uncover or discover in Africa over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Quote of the week.
As we're coming to the end of this conversation, this is something that we've kept as part of the podcast. Often as business people or people in general, we have quotes, mantras, proverbs that we use when times are challenging or even when times are good. Do you have one that you could share with us today?
Yeah, I don't have specific proverb, but I'm always inspired by one person. His name is Tadataka Ino, who made the Japanese map for the first time in Japan. And actually, he was born in a merchant family, and he had to succeed his business. And at that time, Japan was under very strict family rules and succession rules and so on. So he had to work for his family business till he was 40 years old. And at that time, I think average lifetime in Japan was 40 something. So he was already like old people, 80 years old in the current time. But he started learning how to create a map from that age after he was released from family business. And he walked all along the Japanese coast so that he could build that first Japanese map. And I read his book when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I have always been inspired by him. It's never late to start something. And I wasn't so it wasn't so early for me to start my VC career. And lots of people advised me to work for a VC fund in the US or in Japan first before I start anything in Africa. But I was quite adamant. I want to do this in Africa. And I started. And I think I could stay energetic because I had this kind of role model that even the old man can start anything new if he is determined. So that's a kind of thing that always inspires me.
That's a very extremely important message. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, I agree 100%. It's never too late to start. The most important thing is just to get started.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end of the conversation. Do you have any closing remarks, any final calls to action for people listening?
Yeah, I really enjoyed chatting with Tarza, and I'm so happy to be on this podcast. And I hope my story can inspire other people, and hope everyone could be courageous enough to, try anything new in Africa together with us. Thank you.
Amazing. That has been an awesome conversation, Satoshi.
Thank you very much.
Oh, amazing. It's been packed with cutting-edge insight and information, obviously from an investor who is fully embedded in Africa's tech ecosystem. So it's been just value on value and value. So thank you for giving us your time, because I know you're an extremely busy person. So I appreciate it 100%.
I appreciate this opportunity too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we will speak soon.
Yeah, we will speak soon.
Take care.
Thank you, Tarza. Yeah, take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.